part of the problem with pushing back against fears is that you actually take people's agency away. You say, the world's complicated. There's nothing you can do about it. So I've been really trying to figure out, how do I zero in on solutions that counter our understanding of a problem, right? So it's like, no, you don't understand the problem well. Over here, it's actually a different problem, and here's something that we can do about it. I think that when people are given that sense of control, that they react more positively, and they also want to amplify it more. So I've been trying to figure that out, because I think people, they're desperate to do something, or at least to feel like they could do something.
What could go right? I'm Zachary Karabell, the founder of the Progress Network, and I am joined, as always, by Emma Varvaloucas, the executive director of the Progress Network. And we are on season 3 of What Could Go Right, having yet another series of conversations with people whose take on the world is not animated by outrage and despair and anxiety, and is not fundamentally about Armageddon and how far we are between now and it. Which doesn't mean that everybody we talk to is sunlight and roses and looking at the world as if everything is great. It just means seeing the world through the lens of, even if we do have many and manifold problems, what do we do about those? How do we focus on solutions? How do we focus on things that we are doing to make the world presumably a better place, and not on all the things that we know that we're doing to make the world collectively a less good place? And some of that's looking at the news of the day from a different angle, but some of that's also talking to people who may be very robust in their own networks, social networks and otherwise, but are not in the daily drum and cacophony of chaotic news as prominent as they otherwise would be. And one of the points of creating the Progress Network was the idea that any individual, even a famous, powerful, or interesting individual, is atomized in that culture if their voice is more constructive, or if their voice is more optimistic, or if their voice is looking more calmly at the world we're in, and that those voices will just de facto never be more than the sum of their parts unless you try to create a network to connect them, boost them, magnify them, and augment them. And today we're going to be talking to someone who's been a member of the network and has his own robust, interesting life and a whole series of podcasts and magazines, who has a kind of ebullient, let's look at the world, let's do really good things. And I find that incredibly heartening. I find that incredibly important. And one of the things Em and I have talked about, and which we've harped on a bit in these episodes, is, in a world full of kind of angry despair, having a more lighthearted, optimistic, look at what we're doing that's good, look at what we could be doing, look at the people who are doing good things, can seem almost naive, almost willfully naive. And it's fascinating to me continually to come up against that, even in myself. When I encounter a really kind of upbeat person with a cheery, constructive voice, even I have a moment of thinking, oh, please, come on, you're really just not seeing all the things that are wrong. And so that is clearly an issue in our world today. So as we're doing this season, we're going to talk a bit with our guest, and then Emma and I are going to discuss a bit of the news of the week that has gotten less focus and less attention. So Emma, tell us a bit about who we're going to talk to today.
So today we're going to talk to Jason Feifer, who, as you mentioned, is a member of the Progress Network. He's also the editor-in-chief of Entrepreneur Magazine and the host of the podcast Problem Solvers, which is about entrepreneurs solving unexpected problems in their business. It's a really fun podcast. Outside of his entrepreneur stuff, he's the author of the new book, Build for Tomorrow, which is an action plan for embracing change and adapting fast. I think we're going to talk to him a little bit about that today. He's also the host of the podcast Build for Tomorrow. Yes, same name as the book, which is about smart solutions to our most misunderstood problems.
Welcome, Jason, to What Could Go Right. I was saying in our intro, your ears burning intro, that your site and your podcast and a lot of what you talk about has a kind of enthusiasm, an infectious enthusiasm about how you sort of approach the world tonally, the sensibility. A lot of what we have talked about in these podcasts with people and in the work we're trying to do at the Progress Network is engendering a sensibility. Like if you don't start from a certain place, it's hard to get to a certain place. You start from a place of fear and intense fraughtness. It's very hard to find your way to balance. It may equally be true that if you start with too much of a good mood, it's hard to acknowledge when things are really going wrong, but that's fair. That's another issue. Yeah. So in a really softball way, I guess you edit this magazine, you do a podcast, you try to help people, I guess, express their messages and their views, but tell us a little bit about like how did Jason become Jason?
I appreciate that. How did Jason become Jason? I mean, Jason was not always like this. Also, Jason doesn't do well speaking in the third person, so I'll shift. I wasn't always like this. I was a pretty change-resistant kid and also a pretty closed-off kid. I mean, I had friends, but I was very uncomfortable sharing anything vulnerable, And one of the big things that changed for me, which was very small, but in college, I was reading this essay by Dave Eggers. It wasn't actually an essay. It was more of a rant. A student reporter, do you know who Dave Eggers is? He wrote A Heartbreaking Work of Staggering Genius, and then founded McSweeney's literary journal and all these things. He's a great writer. And although I did not like The Circle, sorry, Dave. But I was reading this thing. A student reporter had, like the Harvard Crimson or something, had accused him of selling out in an interview. And he responded with this unbelievably wonderful, very long kind of ranty email that got published and made its way around. And there's a section in it where he talks about that he is a person who likes to say yes, and that he doesn't do well with people who say no. And that when you are on your deathbed, which could happen at any time, you will not be happy about all the ththings that you said no about. You will be regretful of all the things that you did not say yes to. And he wants to say yes to, and he's so eloquent and beautiful about it. I wish I could just recite it by him, but I'll tell you that had a real impact on me, because it made me realize that I was saying no to like way too many things, and that I was, as a result, making my life kind of smaller. And it took a long time to shift my mindset and kind of become a yes person. But once I did, a yes person in the best way possible, because there are a lot of bad yes people. But I'll tell you that as I became a professional and started to meet people who were doing like tremendous things, I found that they all really had yes at the core of what they did too. That they were willing to engage with big ideas, with challenging things, with saying, just because this isn't working doesn't mean that something else can't work. And I really gravitated towards those people. And then as I started to engage with like really big ideas, which my work does on a regular occasion, what I came to realize was that I think that oftentimes what we do is we simplify narratives so that they fit something that feels more comfortable to us. Right? So how can we take this big complicated thing and find the smallest version of it possible that we can then all obsess over? And to me, that's basically saying no, right? Like that's basically saying, the world is complicated, but I'm not really interested in that. What I'm interested in is this one tiny little thing. And I that makes me feel comfortable, and I get to be upset about it, but also that I'm not really now in charge of fixing anything, because it's I've made it impossible to really address any big substantive issue. And so I just get to be sitting here comfortably in my little corner and complaining, and maybe going on TV and doing it, or frankly, maybe getting a publicly elected office and doing it. But I just don't find that to be compelling. I find that complicated, big issues require complicated, big thinking, and that you can only engage with that if you are a yes person, if you're willing to engage with big ideas, with big solutions, with big challenges, with long time horizons, with holding multiple things in your head at the same time. I find these to be just far more interesting and compelling. That oftentimes, if you take a look at difficult issues and you give it enough of a time horizon, and you are open to enough of the different challenges of the world, that you will see that there are ultimately resolutions to them. And that's, I guess, how Jason got made.
This is like the improv comedy motto to life, like yes and
yes, and that's
and.
Totally, that really is true, because I don't know. I mean, I spend most of my days talking with entrepreneurs, and it is absolutely fascinating to see how they, I mean, look, they have it all on the line, right? They've built something, they've put their own finances into it. They have other people's livelihoods and families who depend on them. They have so much pressure. And yet when big changes come, they have it within themselves to say, you know what, I think that we need to take risks and be open to the possibility that there's a better way to do the thing that we're already doing. And the result of that is going to be that we're serving people in new ways that we maybe didn't even set out to do. That's bold and very hard and emotionally draining, but the rewards are tremendous. And you spend enough time with those people and you realize that a lot more is possible than what we might think, but it requires thinking beyond whatever we see in front of us.
So tell me, when you are engaged by somebody professionally,
Yeah.
not just when you're into them, what are they asking you for help with? Like, an entrepreneur comes and says, I started this company and I need help doing X. What's the X that you're going to help them do?
Oh, well, I mean, me personally, if people come to me, they're often asking me. So I'm in a very interesting position where I'm seen as a pattern matcher, and for good reason, because I get to talk to everybody and I spend time telling their stories and understanding what people have in common. And so if somebody asks me, have I heard of somebody trying this or that thing before? I often have an answer, right? Like there's often, oh yes, well that reminds me of that time where I was talking to the founder of this thing, and right. So I become this kind of Rolodex of experience, which I think is useful to people, and then also because my background is in media, people want to know how to get press. I spent a lot of time talking about that, but what's really interesting about the press thing is which I realize that your audience is probably not like entrepreneurs looking for press, but I will tell you that the thing that I find fascinating about people who are looking for press is that they often haven't thought through why they want it. They will tell me, just the other day, a guy booked me for a consulting session, and he starts and he's like, we've built this company and it's this like B2B AI, something or other company. And they've scaled up and they're doing like tens of $millions of revenue. And he's like, nobody's ever written about us. And I just feel like we deserve some attention. And I want, my staff to feel good about that attention. And I said to him, look, that's fine. It's a nice thing to think about, but like, press is a tool. And you don't go out and raise money just because it feels good. You don't go and do like anything substantive just because it feels good. You should do it because it has a purpose. And if press doesn't have a purpose in your business, then why are you doing it? And the reason I'm telling you guys this now is because I actually think that oftentimes we chase things simply because they seem like they're part of the path that we're supposed to follow, rather than because they serve a actual genuine purpose in our lives and our world, or whatever it is that we're trying to build, right? Like we're often so caught up in what is the thing that people think we should be doing that we don't spend enough time thinking about what do we actually need to solve this problem for us right now. And when you think more strategically about everything that you do and the reason why you're doing it, I think that you find that you waste a lot of time chasing things just because they seem like they feel good or because somebody else told you that they're useful. That's just, don't follow a path because it's someone else's path. That doesn't make any sense. That doesn't get you anywhere. Define success for yourself. That's the only way in which you actually build something.
So Jason, I wanted to, go back to your first answer really quickly, because it was really funny that you mentioned that you were change resistant when you were younger, because you just wrote a book about adapting to change. So I won't make that, sort of psychoanalytic loop or anything, but I did want to know, like, when you look at, because this is a topic that like people have talked a lot about, right? But you wouldn't have added to it if you didn't think that there was really something to add. So it made me wonder, like, is there a lot of bad advice out there about change? Like, is there something where you're like, I really wish people would stop saying this and stop believing this? And like, what would you replace that with?
Yeah. So Silicon Valley gets picked on too much. I realize there's a lot to pick on. I'm not excusing the things that are worth picking on, but like, sometimes like the answer to why there's a problem here is not because of Silicon Valley. It's just, I feel like it becomes a punchline, but all the same, something that I think is a mistake that people often make in Silicon Valley is that they've created something new, and the way in which they introduce it to the world is basically by saying, "Hey, this old thing that you do is stupid, and you should stop it because it doesn't work as well as this new thing that I created." And people don't like that, and there's a good reason why they don't like that. It is because people don't like new things. What people like are better versions of old things. What people like is something that is familiar to them, but an improvement. And a story that I love to tell is the car. So, when the automobile was first introduced in the late 1800s, it wasn't called the car because nobody had that word. It was called the horseless carriage. And that's if you were being generous. And if you were not, then you called it the devil wagon, because that's often what people called it. They hated this thing. They threw rocks at it. They yelled, "Get a horse!" like as a car was driving down the street. And then when we tell the story now of how the car became the dominant mode of transportation, we often tell the story of Henry Ford. Henry Ford, he revolutionized manufacturing. And as a result, he made cars more accessible and affordable to the average person. True, but something else happened before that Henry Ford was the beneficiary of. And that is often not a story that's told, but I heard it from a automobile historian. And it basically goes like this. So in the early days, the automobile industry was trying to figure out, like, why do people not like this thing? And they looked at their own marketing and they realized that they were talking about the car as a replacement to the horse, right? Just like Silicon Valley often talks about this new thing as a replacement to this whole thing. But people don't, like I said, people don't like that. The horse was a member of their family. That horse had been in their families for generations. And now you got somebody coming along saying, like, basically stop doing that. It doesn't work as well as this other thing. People don't like that because, like I said, people don't like new things. They like better versions of old things. So the car industry realized they needed to make a change. And the change that they made was that they stopped talking about the car as a replacement to the horse, and they started talking about the car as a better horse. They started using or popularizing terms like horsepower. They started naming cars after horses, which we still do today. They started putting mechanical horse heads on the front of cars, which we obviously don't do today. And the result of that was that they built what I like to call a bridge of familiarity, where they stopped trying to just say, I have a great solution and let me thrust it upon the world. They instead started from the position of where people are. Where are people right now? What are they concerned about? What do they need? And then build from the consumer to themselves, or build from the audience to themselves. I call it the bridge of familiarity. And the thing that I guess, to go back to your question about what is the advice that I don't really like, I think that there is too much out there, which is basically amounts to like, hey, this new thing is better, so just by its dint of newness, you should like it. Because, people, that puts people on the defensive. People aren't comfortable with that. And that's not a smart way to approach introducing change, or frankly, trying to manage your own change in your own lives. So instead, what we need to do is understand where the panic comes from, relate to it, accept that it's a normal part of the experience of change, and then build from there. And I it's very interesting because I came up with this framework that change happens in 4 phases: panic, adaptation, new normal, and wouldn't go back. And whenever I talk to people,
this is the 4 phases of change as opposed to the 5 stages of grief philosophy.
Yes. Well, look, there's a lot of blank phases of blank frameworks in the world, and I picked mine. But I when I talk to people about it, they often pause and say, "Oh, you know what? I totally panic. Maybe I'm in a panic stage right now." And that's okay. Let's recognize that people panic, and that if we can address people in that moment and help them get out of it, that we're all going to be better for it.
Yeah, I mean, it's an important, back to our sensibility thing, like that whole mantra you just articulated really is helping people get into a framework, literally a state of mind, from which they can then solve whatever challenges they have, as opposed to, if they're not in that, it gets really, really challenging. And, part of it is, one of the more vibrant aspects of certainly American, but let's call it Western capitalism over the past 20 years, has been some of the innovations that have led to, this medium like Zoom or a podcast or things that are technologically enhanced conversations and connections. And as you just mentioned, we're kind of in the downside of the upside when it comes to how we look at tech, how we look at big tech, how we look at the consequences of these tools that have been created, right? But a lot of those tools have transformed the way we communicate and the way we interact. Again, we're focused right now on all the ways in which that's can be incredibly negative and creates hot emotions and creates addictiveness and attention and all of that. But a lot of what you're talking about is, even if some of these downsides are true, there's a way to approach these changes that is not one of like despair and panic, right?
Right. That's exactly right. And this is why I love the work that you guys do. So I think we ask the wrong question of new things in our lives or in society, because the question that we ask is this perfect? Is this perfect?
Mm.
And I mean, I'll tell you the answer to the question. The answer is no. Like, nothing is perfect. So that's not how we have to think of things, because if the filter in which we're going to look at something is this perfect? And the answer is going to be no. And then we're going to want to discard this new thing. So instead, what we should ask is a different question. And that question is this new problem better than our old problem? Because once you ask that, you make room for problems. And you also say that let's measure progress, not by perfection, not by a standard that cannot be reached, but rather by whether or not we are improving the problems that we're grappling with. And I think that people often mistake new things for whole downside. Because let's use your example of Zoom, because it's a really good one. So, if you go far enough back to the introduction of the telephone, what you'll find is a lot of people who were concerned that the telephone would replace human to human contact. That why would anybody ever go over to somebody's home when now you could call them on the phone? And of course, what really happened was that we found uses for calling people on the phone, and we retained uses for coming over and talking to someone. Or like, I don't have to run over to your home now to ask you a simple question. I can call you, but for a longer, more engaged period of time, I would much rather be at your home. What we have is a world of both, but we don't really believe that a world of both is going to be possible. We tend to think of a world of replacement, that new is going to wholesale replace old. So telephone will replace all forms of, like interaction. Zoom will replace all forms of, well, also human interaction. Why again would we ever meet because we have Zoom now? And instead, what we have found with Zoom is that it is a really nice supplement to everything that we already had, that we interact in ways that were unexpected. I've found a lot of entrepreneurs have told me that Zoom meetings can often feel more intimate than standard business meetings, because you're at home, you have to see people's homes, the kids run into the room, and you just feel like you're a part of people's lives in a way that you wouldn't have before. It's not a replacement for everything. It's integrated into the way in which we have another tool at our disposal. And that is almost always the case with new innovation. And I think that we miss that point. And as a result, we see something new. We say, here's what we're going to lose. And we extrapolate that loss and say, well, now we've lost everything. I'm going to lose this, and I'm going to lose that, and I'm going to lose that. We don't make the space for the possibility of gain and for new innovation to settle in and create new value. So this is why I like long tail thinking, because when you look at something with a long time horizon, you allow for the possibility of new uses, of new discovery of uses, of new experiences that could not have been anticipated at the beginning of the introduction of something. And that's where you ultimately often see the greatest value. We don't know what new innovations are for until sometime later. And so let's give ourselves the space to discover that.
That's what's some of your most fun work, in my opinion, is when you go into history and you talk about fears that seem so quaint now, like when the teddy bear was introduced, or the long form novel, and people were like freaking out in the newspapers. And it definitely lends some perspective to some of the things that we're freaking out about today.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the reason I like history is because the story's been told. Right. So, my podcast, for those who don't know, Build for Tomorrow, often takes these deep dives into history as a means of trying to understand the things that we're talking about today. And I don't do it to discount changes that are happening today, right? It's not like, oh, because we worried about this 100 years ago that the worry today is meaningless, but rather to say, because we worried about this 100 years ago, let's see what ultimately drove a resolution, because that might open a way forward now. And also just to recognize that, new changes, one of the most powerful things anybody said to me, which I've like just really thought a lot about, was I called this guy David Scheimer, I believe his name was, who wrote a book about the 100 years of Russian efforts to interfere with American elections. He said that he got going on this book because he was hearing, after the 2016 elections, he was hearing politicians and people in media talk about what happened as unprecedented. And he said, look, that's actually a really problematic way of viewing the world, because if you see something as unprecedented, then number one, you're going to limit your scope of where the problem is to something that's very new, because obviously something new must have caused something that is unprecedented. But also it opens the possibility for all sorts of kind of lies and stories, right? So I mean, think about it. If I woke up tomorrow and I looked in the mirror and my face was green, that's never happened before, so that's unprecedented. And therefore I would think, well, crap, what happened yesterday, right? Like, what was the thing that happened yesterday that turned my face green? What was it? What did I eat? What did I touch? But when we're talking about Russian interference in American elections, that wasn't unprecedented. In fact, what happened in 2016 by David Scheimer's reporting is a version of what they've been doing for a century, right? Basically utilizing the newest technologies of the day to exacerbate existing divisions in American culture. Did it with television, did it with newspapers, did it with radio, then did it with social media. So if you think that the problem is unprecedented, then you're going to say, oh, the problem is social media. So then we've got to shut down social media, or we've got to make massive changes to social media. And that's not to say that social media didn't play a role, but if you throw Mark Zuckerberg in jail, you don't solve the problem. So we need to have a better understanding of a more complex problem, which means that we have to understand that this has been around for a long time. The more that you can understand the history of a problem, the more that you can appreciate the complexities of it today. And therefore, the more you can actually start to move yourselves towards real solutions.
History, complexity, subtlety, understanding, perspective.
Shocking.
Oh my God, those are like fighting words. I don't know what are you talking about, as opposed to just reaction and of the moment, and there is no past, and who the hell knows what the future is going to be. This is, again, I think there is more, and you certainly find this in your own work, there's more resonance with urging people in this direction than you would believe if you just listen to kind of the news of the day or an argument on the street. People do live in these realities, right? They do want to know, they do want to understand. It's just, it gets drowned out and lost and hard to see. There's still, markets may be cascading and IPOs may be drying up and venture capital may have been in a bubble, but there's still a lot of venture capitalists and there's still a lot of entrepreneurs who are actually just trying to do interesting, compelling, sometimes innovative, sometimes silly things with real enthusiasm about what the future is going to be. And we do risk, I think, losing sight of that. Yeah, in our rush to, oh my God, everything's falling apart.
Without question. And I will tell you that I had an interesting revelation a little while ago about why. I was wondering, like, why does a product like The Social Dilemma, that horror show of a Netflix documentary, like why does that capture people's attention in the way that compelling and deeply reported messages that basically say the world is more complex and it's not as bad as it seems? Like, why does that not resonate as much? And I came to this realization, and this is like something I've been working on for my own work, and I'd be curious what you guys think of it for your work, which is, I think the problem often with pushing back against fears is that it comes off as saying, oh, there's nothing to worry about. And
Right.
if there's nothing to worry about, then there's nothing for people to do. And people like something to do. They like to feel like there's something that they can do, even if frankly they're not going to do it, or the thing that they're told to do is just simply impractical, which is like the takeaways of the social dilemma were like so absurdly impractical that they're not going to be utilized by anybody living in the world today. But it gave people a sense of agency. And I think part of the problem with pushing back against fears is that you actually take people's agency away. You say, the world's complicated. There's nothing you can do about it. So I've been really trying to figure out, how do I zero in on solutions that counter our understanding of a problem, right? So it's like, no, you don't understand the problem well. Over here, it's actually a different problem, and here's something that we can do about it. I think that when people are given that sense of control, that they react more positively, and they also want to amplify it more. So I've been trying to figure that out, because I think people, they're desperate to do something, or at least to feel like they could do something.
Yeah, I definitely see that a lot when we send out, for instance, our weekly newsletter, and we kind of the takeaway at the end of the day is always like the world is more complicated than a simple, clickbait headline is going to give us. And people very frequently write in and say, like, what can I do? It doesn't feel right to tell them, like, well, not much, but like be informed, and like that's going to slowly lead you into a better place. So, I guess it's just we're, wrapping up our time here. Have you settled on a good answer to that? Like, what do you give people when they're asking you for that kind of agency? Because I think we also have this twin problem of like, people are hungry for something to do, and yet there's also this feeling of like learned helplessness a lot, particularly in American society, that like even if they do something, it's not going to matter and it's not going to make a difference. So maybe you can chew on that for us.
So where I often land on that is that I think people can start with themselves. And by the way, I have a 3-year-old at the door. So see, I told you, Zoom.
Speaking of Zoom intimacy,
guys,
hi,
hi everybody. Dude, my 3-year-old is now calling me Jason. Yeah.
Yeah. Can you use the potty? You have to clean the potty.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, that'll keep things in
That's
perspective.
something to do. Yeah, I mean,
that is something to do.
I've been
What is
something
that? That's like the old Buddhist. What is enlightenment? Chop wood and carry water, right?
Yep,
that's
right.
kind of a latter day version of it for you.
I mean, I feel like that is a sort of general mission for the world, right? After you use the potty, you got to clean the potty. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's a metaphor for life, really.
It actually
is for everything that we were talking about right now. See, but can I say, I know that we're a little beyond our time here, but I will. I'm going to answer your question, but first I'm going to tell you that back in the early days of the pandemic, those moments used to stress me out, when the kids would come barging in and I'd be on a podcast or I'd be speaking and people would have been paying for me for my time or whatever. And then I came to realize that actually these moments of interruption and unexpectedness are like they're the most human parts of anything that we're doing. And that when you will let that curtain down a bit, or I don't know if that's the right metaphor, but whatever, you part that curtain, that people feel more connected. It brings a little more humanity, right? Like up until that moment, I was like expert guy going on and on and on. And now I'm guy with a 3-year-old who's telling me to clean the potty. Right. And like, and that actually people like that. Like it'll become the most memorable part of this episode for people. And I think that's a good thing. That just means, like embrace the messiness of what you're doing, because ultimately people's lives are messiness and they see themselves in your messiness. So anyway, there's my advice. But to your question, I mean, look, sometimes with very large, complicated problems, the thing that you can give people to do is maybe going to feel a little unsatisfying, right? Because it's going to be like, you can join this group or you can send this message. So oftentimes what I do is actually try to get people to understand themselves. Like I did an episode on misinformation, but the way that I approached it was to examine all of these fun facts that we all think we know, right? Like a goldfish has a 10-second memory, and like these things aren't true at all. Like we're kind of full of all these fun facts that are actually completely wrong. And then to understand why they're all wrong, or why they stick in our heads so much, right? Which is to understand this thing called the the availability heuristic, which
Mm.
which is that if something is easy to remember and easy to recall, then it feels true to you, which is how misinformation can very easily lodge in people's brains and feel like fact. So, you give people some insight into their own brains, and then you give them a kind of missions, which is basically like the next time that you hear something that feels true, consider more deeply whether it is true, because that is actually the first barrier of defense for misinformation. And now that's something that they can do on a daily basis. And they can also tell friends about it, and it makes them feel smarter, and it makes them, at the next dinner party, they're going to bring something like that up. And so I feel like if you can arm people with what to do, even inward facing, that it makes them feel more empowered to make change that's outward facing.
Amen, brother. I will take that any day of the week. It would be good to, with all these things, it'd be good to have an hour more, 2 hours more. And look, we do have an hour more. I just don't know that people would listen for an hour more. I mean, they would. They certainly do to Joe Rogan. So maybe we can reconsider the elasticity.
Yeah, I mean, for what it's worth, I apparently have a potty to clean.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, I mean,
you got something to do.
Time's a wasting, man. So
right.
Clearly.
That potty won't clean itself.
Well, on that metaphorical and very pungently literal note, I want to thank you for joining us. Everyone should go read Jason's book, and we'll provide links to it on the site. Change is Inevitable. That's not the name of the book. Build for Tomorrow, but Change is Inevitable is part of it.
Yeah, have a little visual
Build for Tomorrow.
Yeah. Well, thanks, guys. Thanks for the great work you do. I love the newsletter. I love being a part of the network. And, we can pick this conversation back up. Next time we talk, I'll update you on how the potty went.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Good luck.
Thank you, Jason.
Guys. Thanks.
So, and again, I love Jason's energy, and he's like exhibit A of how you start and the sensibility you start with. I know I'm sounding like a broken record here, but it feels like a record that needs to be played endlessly because it isn't as out there as it should be. Like, we need to be on some Spotify playlist.
The other thing that I love about Jason is that he combines business with life hacks, with history, with like psychology, with this and with that. And it's just kind of like, it's hard to put him in a box. And it's great. Like he can talk to you about 10 different topics. I think that's also rare these days. Like, people have their lane, they stay in their lane, and they're an expert on that thing. And Jason is like, no, I don't know how he does it, to be honest. I mean, his day must be packed.
Yeah, and that's also an interesting point of maybe the degree to which we're all so siloed professionally and in terms of micro expertise. Maybe that doesn't get enough attention as one of the other barriers to communication. Like, nobody's a generalist, and there's so much specific knowledge and specific skill sets in so many different walks of life that it becomes harder for people to talk to each other professionally. We know that it's harder for people to talk to each other personally in like a hyperpolarized climate. But yeah, the degree to which cutting across multiple fields, wearing multiple hats, I certainly have embraced that, can be something that allows you to be more connective, right? Because you're not as segmented in this very specific area, and you don't have a lane that's so clear. Of course, it's easier to have accidents when you don't stay in your lane. So that's the flip side to that particular issue. Shall we turn to the news of the week?
Yeah, so I have one that I really think is a big one that I really don't think almost anyone knows, even people surrounding this particular country. And before I say the news, I'll say that I think that you can see in many countries worldwide these small steps for women's rights and LGBTQ rights. They are in fits and spurts, and they don't often make the news. But there is a lot of progress going on. And the news that we want to talk about in particular today is Slovenia is the first.
Slovenia.
When's the last time that we talked about Slovenia? Never.
That would be never.
Yeah. So Slovenia, post-communist / socialist bloc, the first country from that bloc to legalize same-sex marriage. They just did that last week, which is pretty cool. And with the same piece of legislation that legalizes same-sex marriages, they've also legalized same-sex couples to adopt children, which is great.
And if I am not incorrect, notice the double negative there, you did a TikTok for the Progress Network that went Slovenian viral based on the good news coming out of Slovenia.
Yes, it went post-communist bloc viral, and it was one of those things where it was very heartening. It was very exciting to see other people being excited for Slovenia. And then the comments were also full of people from Czech Republic, Poland, Estonia, Lithuania saying like, can we be next? Can we be next? So, the other countries in the area, Estonia has agreed to recognize same-sex unions created in other countries from 2016. Croatia, Czech Republic, Hungary, Montenegro, they all have same-sex civil partnerships. But other than that, like I said, fits and starts.
That's a funny one about Estonia, right? We're not going to actually make it legal, but we'll make it legal for other people to do it somewhere else, and then we won't fight it as long as you did it after 2016.
Yeah, and there's also a really funny little loophole going on right now with China, and I think it's Utah, because Utah has the law that recognizes same-sex marriages. They will recognize them also if they're done out of country. So what Chinese gay couples are doing are zooming into Utah, getting married in Utah, because Utah will recognize the union. And of course, it's not sort of valid in China, but it's just to do it. So
who says globalism is dead?
Yeah, exactly. The power of Zoom is still with us post-pandemic.
What else should we be taking a look at other than your sudden and astonishing TikTok fame?
Pretending to be the Slovenian High Court, nonetheless. Yes. So I also want to talk about NASA today, because NASA is up to some cool SHIT. I don't think I can say that on this podcast. This is family friendly, but we had mentioned in last season, I think it was an interview we did with Greg Easterbrook, that NASA is up to this very daring and potentially life-saving thing where there is a possibility, we don't know how large or how small, but there is a possibility that an asteroid might one day come back to Earth and kill us all, or maybe just demolish a city, dinosaur style. And NASA has actually gone through the steps of figuring out how to knock a spacecraft into an asteroid to knock that asteroid out of its orbit / out of its course towards Earth, if that ever were to happen. And they actually just hit an asteroid with a spacecraft for the first time recently.
Yeah, no, I saw that, and it reminded me a little of the movie almost 20 years ago, Armageddon, which was a different kind of Armageddon as opposed to the one that we're trying to combat. This was about the asteroid that was going to hit the Earth, that is saved by Bruce Willis and Ben Affleck and a whole series of motley crew people.
The goal is to prevent scenes like this: an asteroid colliding with Earth, creating a devastating impact like the kind that led to the extinction of the dinosaurs.
Our job was to model how that impact would happen, model what the crater would look like.
Los Alamos National Lab scientist Wendy Caldwell talked with us about her involvement with the project, which NASA is calling a major success. Video shows the moment of impact, when NASA's DART spacecraft slammed into an asteroid 7 million miles away, pushing the asteroid off course.
This is a watershed moment for planetary defense and a watershed moment for humanity.
For the first time ever, humanity has changed the orbit of a planetary body.
I mean, NASA has not gotten a lot of great accolades, mostly because of their bureaucracy and their kind of sclerotic use of lots of funds for little output, although the recent telescope was absolutely extraordinary. And it is a reminder that there are things that government can do well. I mean, I think we talked to Che Bolden too about Inter-Astra and his whole sort of the new emerging space economy that clearly NASA has been not a leader in the past 10 years relative to SpaceX and other more private institutions, but it remains a bundle of potential. And this was a good sign that, as you say, they can actually do things that are both creative and important.
Yeah, and it's cool that one day we may not have Bruce Willis, but we may have NASA with the asteroid coming to Earth.
Deep,
how's that?
Deep thoughts. Also, Deep Impact. Speaking of deep thoughts, where the asteroid, kind of hit.
Is this another movie?
It's another movie.
Okay.
Yeah, another
Okay.
with Morgan Freeman playing
Oh.
the president and Tia Leone. Anyway, you can all go
Anyway.
look up asteroid disaster movies for 500, Alex.
Well, I have one more thing about NASA, so we can add this onto the Jeopardy board. Obviously, right now, one of our huge sources of emissions are airplanes and all of this airplane travel. And one of the things that's actually preventing us from emissionless airplanes is batteries. Another thing that like doesn't sound so fun and exciting, but it's actually fun and exciting because NASA has developed a new kind of battery called solid state batteries, and they're lighter, they're safer. There's no liquids in them, so it's not like a lithium battery, which
Hence
means
the word solid state.
Solid state, exactly. But that means in a plane, because it's lighter, you can put it into an aircraft or like really large vehicles. It's not going to overheat or catch fire. And it means that like in the future, we could actually be on a plane that not only is good for the planet, but is completely silent. So
that is true. We are a ways away from the either commercialization or even the NASification of the deployment of these, but it is a reminder that there is a whole bevy, a whole plethora of technologies that are in sort of far more than experimental stage and far less than commercial deployment stage that we just don't hear about as much because they have not shown up in Teslas and they haven't shown up yet. But there are certainly a lot of people who would argue quite passionately that we are only a heartbeat away from a battery revolution that will really change the equation, not just of cars, but of planes and helicopters and sort of everything.
Yeah. And it's a good reminder too that NASA is not just dealing with like random space rocks, right? There's
correct.
A lot of real world applications like we've talked about with Shay as well. So that's it for space. I've got one more.
We're done with space. We've done space.
We're done. We've talked about it twice and we're done. But I have one more. I'm curious if any of our American listeners have seen this change in pharmacies yet, because it's supposed to be sort of starting on the ground now, that hearing aids can be bought over the counter.
I'm sorry, what?
Hearing. I fell for that for a half second before I caught that joke.
Big day for millions of Americans with hearing loss. For the first time, hearing aids are available over the counter at major pharmacy chains and other retailers without the need to see a doctor first.
So I don't know how many people know this. I guess if you're listening to this podcast, you probably don't know this, or you've already gone through the hearing aid process. Anyway, you need a prescription to get a hearing aid. And hearing aids are quite expensive. And obviously, anyone who's American knows that if you can avoid getting caught in the insurance tornado, it's better not to. And this legislation was actually introduced by Senator Elizabeth Warren. I think it was 2016 or 17, 2017. And it's taken up till now to be put through and realized on the ground in pharmacies. But for me, this is like a rare American insurance win that something has gotten, taken out of the claws of American insurance companies.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole set of regulatory capture issues, right, that began with good intentions, protecting the consumer. You still can't buy contact lenses through Warby Parker without a prescription from a licensed either doctor or ophthalmologist. And
that's a very specific experience, it sounds like.
but it's it's like the hearing aid one of you can't buy certain things that I'm sure there was a perfectly reasonable reason why you needed a gated experience or you needed to have someone sign off. I mean, eyewear maybe because you shouldn't be undercorrected when you're driving, but once these things are much more ubiquitously available, cheaper, and it's hard to imagine like what harm a hearing aid would do if you feel you can't hear. So hopefully things will move much more in that direction rather than in a restrictive, we're going to make sure that you have to go through 14 different hoops in order to get something that you could walk into a pharmacy and buy.
Right. Yeah. And I did mention cheaper, but cheaper, they are definitely supposed to be from, $4,000 or $5,000 for like a really nice one to a few hundred. So yeah,
that would be cheaper.
That would be cheaper. And I should say too, that it's possible to go overboard on this. I live in Greece, as people who listen to the podcast will know. And up until very recently, you did not need a prescription to get antibiotics, which meant that antibiotics were being, passed around like candy, and lots of people with viral infections taking antibiotics, which is bad for all sorts of reasons. So, yeah.
The argument is it's the Goldilocks situation, right? You don't want no regulation, and you don't want intense thickets of regulation. You want the right amount of regulation that is suited to the issue and the moment, and finding that happy median is not easy, and no one gets it right, but maybe there's a self-corrective mechanism going on to help us get it right. We can do that'll be our next season. What could go right?
Sounds great. I mean, at least with hearing aids that you're not going to create some kind of like antibiotic resistant something or other that's going to take over humanity. So there's that.
Sure. There is that. So that's our news of the week. And again, these are things that people I'm sure were aware of in little nuggets. I think one of my teenage sons mentioned the asteroid deflecting NASA thing because it was cool. But they are not the kinds of things that get headline attention. There's no such thing as good news. Yes, occasionally there's a medical breakthrough, a scientific breakthrough that gets accolades and notice when it's extraordinary and unusual. And the recent, the telescope and the pictures that the Space Telescope provided were, I think a lot of people saw those and were astonished and really transported. It was a really nice moment of almost like all of us taking a deep breath, looking up, either metaphorically or literally, and seeing the wonders of what we do not know out there. But those moments are rare, and they should be less rare.
Absolutely. Amen. Hosanna. All of those things.
Thank you again, Emma.
Thanks, Zachary.